Have you ever listened to somebody speak, and from the very first words they say, you get an idea of what's going to come next? You can help me out for a minute here. Let me demonstrate. If I stand up here and say, once upon a time, what would you expect to come next? A fairy story. Okay? If I were to say, dearly beloved, we are gathered here together, you would expect a wedding. Not that I've ever begun a wedding with those exact words, I have to say. But you get the gist. The first part, if I was to say something like this, the party of the first part assigns to the party the second part, you would expect us to be in court, in a court setting. If I say, open your Bibles to John 3:16, you might expect God so loved the world. You might expect a sermon, a Bible reading, an exposition, whatever. If you say, and I'm allowed to say this, a Scotsman, an Englishman, and an Irishman walked into a bar, you might expect a joke. Quite often, how something is introduced actually tells us a lot about what's going to follow. We call it in literacy terms, we call it the form of a sentence. The form in which something is written is meant to prepare us for what comes next. For example, if I began with a poem and you expect a legal document, we're going to miss each other. We're not going to be on the same page. There are many literary forms within the Bible. There's poetry, there's proverb, there's legalism, there's dramatic narrative. People who say the Bible's boring have never read the drama and the stories and the way they're told. There's hymn, there's sermon, there's theological discourse, there's personal letters, there's apocalyptic vision, and sprinkled into all of this, there are figures of speech and words which highlight what the Bible is trying to tell us. And so we're going to look this morning at just one of those forms that Jesus used in order to communicate with his audience and to get over to them some kind of major point he wanted them to understand. I'm talking about Jesus' use of parables or of stories. Jesus was the master storyteller. For example, instead of launching into a 1-hour lecture on who my neighbor is, Jesus told the story of the Good Samaritan. And he's all the time doing this in the Gospels. Many of the parables were true stories taken from daily life. And they're told, in fact, as fact, in the present tense. And if we know our Bibles and just think for a moment, we've seen seed growing, yeast at work in dough, children playing, sheep grazing, and we all know what it's like to lose something, don't we? Jesus told true stories about these everyday things. Some of the parables were real story parables, stories which may not or may have actually happened. The historicity is not that important because they were meant to convey a specific and significant truth. Then there are example stories, giving us examples to either follow or avoid, focusing on the character, the conduct of the individual. But perhaps what the parables show to us as a whole, more than anything else, is that Jesus was fully acquainted with human life in multiple ways and means. Just think about it. He was knowledgeable enough to speak about farming, sowing seeds, and reaping a harvest. Not only was he familiar with the workaday world of the farmer, the fisherman, the builder, the merchant, but he also moved with equal ease among the managers of estates, the ministers of finance at royal court, the judge in a court of law, the Pharisees, the tax collectors. His stories portray the lives of men, of women, of children, the poor, the rich, the outcast, the exalted. He knew about work and wages, weddings and festive occasions, as well as funerals and sickness. He used an understood, familiar truth in order to teach an unfamiliar or unrealized lesson. And when we come to these stories, let's not forget what we already know. We're not looking at a legal document in which every word is very carefully chosen. Neither are we looking at a joke or a poem. Remember, when Jesus was using parables, he was using story. It's meant to make an immediate impact and was to be enjoyed and re-experienced and thought about over time, not necessarily dissected and torn apart and analysed word by word. Behind the story is a major point, usually coming at the end of the story, determined by the context of what's being said. I said earlier my son was 32 on Friday, which is really hard to believe for so many reasons. But I was thinking back, as you do on birthdays, to when he was very small. And he had favourite stories. And his favourite stories were about Thomas the Tank Engine. And we used to have Thomas the Tank Engine every bedtime, every car journey. So I lived about 80 miles from my parents, and to drive through there, I had 80 miles of Thomas the Tank Engine because it kept him entertained. He knew every word. You couldn't skip a page, or he would say, "Mummy, you didn't say that bit." He absorbed these stories, and then if we were with my mum and dad, he would say, "Grandad, you make up a new Thomas story because I know them all." And then my dad would sit and make up a new story about Thomas the Tank. It certainly made an impression on my son when he was about 2 years old. And it stayed with him for quite a while, till he moved on to bananas and pajamas. His daddy once told him he'd thrown the bananas and pajamas videotape over the deck of a cross-channel ferry because the submariners wanted something new to watch in their submarines. So tired did we get of bananas in pajamas. Stories have power. Stories influence us. And Jesus was the master storyteller. And so we look today at this parable of the two builders, building on two foundations. It's told in both Matthew 7 and Luke 6. And the Synoptic Gospels, we know, are inundated with his stories. And his stories reveal his heart. I like to think that Jesus' stories tell his autobiography and the autobiography of God the Father. In 1174, the Italian architect Bonanno Pizzano began work on what would become his most famous project, a separately standing 8-story bell tower for the cathedral of the city of Pisa. The tower was to be 8 stories and 185 feet tall. There was just one little problem. The builders quickly discovered that the soil was much softer than they had anticipated, and the foundations they had built were far too shallow to adequately hold the structure in place. And sure enough, before long, the tower began to tilt. And it continued to tilt until finally the architect and the builders realized nothing could be done to make the Leaning Tower of Pisa straight again. It took 176 years to finish building this tower. I think I'd have given up. And during that time, many things were done to try and compensate for this tilt. The foundation was shored up. The upper levels were built at an angle to try and make the top of the tower straight, and nothing worked. The tower, though, has stood for over 800 years, but it leans 18 feet away from where it should be, or 10 degrees off the vertical, if there are any engineers present. One day, experts say it will fall because it wasn't built on the right foundation. Well, Jesus told a good story about the importance of a solid foundation, didn't he? He'd not long finished giving the infamous Sermon on the Mount. He so desperately wanted his audience, if you like, to go and do what he had just taught them, because he wanted to implement his kingdom of righteousness here on earth. And so he tells this story. And in his story, he uses, as he often did, three very common images: a house, a rock, and some sand. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does them is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The Message paraphrase puts the verses like this: these words I speak to you are not incidental additions to your life, home-over improvements to your standard of living. They are foundational words, words to build a life upon. If you work these words into your life, you are like a smart carpenter who built his house on solid rock. Rain poured down, the river flooded, a tornado hit, but nothing moved that house. It was fixed to the rock. But if you just use my words in Bible studies but don't work them into your lives, you are like a stupid carpenter who built his house on the sandy beach. When a storm rolled in and the waves came up, it collapsed like a house of cards. Luke reminds us in his explanation, everyone who comes to me and listens to my words and puts them into practice, I'll show you what he's like. He's like a man building a house who dug down deep and laid the foundation on bedrock. The people that Jesus was talking to, because we have to remember, these were stories. They were meant to be heard. That was the ministry of Jesus. They weren't written down immediately and passed around. They were meant just to be heard. They often witnessed sudden downpours during the rainy season in ancient Palestine. Dry creek beds could turn very quickly into violent streams in just a few moments after a cloudburst. And according to the story of Jesus, when you combine these torrential rains and raging streams with mediocre built housing that often included dried mud and sand as a building material, all of this sat on a shifting foundation such as sand. You would have a disaster on your hands. We've all seen pictures, and some of us have witnessed firsthand the damage floods can do. In the year 2007, we were living in the wonderful city of Hull. We lived there for 10 years in East Yorkshire. And out of nowhere, it seemed, severe floods hit not just the city, but all the surrounding villages. 90% of the schools were damaged. Much of the housing was damaged beyond repair. And much of the housing was damaged, and it seemed quite mildly, but years later, had a severe effect because it had damaged the foundations of the houses. We were plunged into action, and within 24 hours, our community hall, which was almost as big as the downstairs of this church, was filled to the ceiling with donations from the generous public to help people who had lost everything. The Member of Parliament came to see us with his film crew to see what was happening and how we were responding. And he wanted to be filmed helping us to open some of the bags of donations. So I'd sorted some through to make sure what was in them was clean, because you never knew what you were receiving. But he came in and he says, no, I'll just pick a bag off the pile. And on live TV, he opened it and pulled out something so inappropriate you would not believe. It was quite funny. But we were working really hard during that time, both within the city and within the outlying villages. And then there came a day where they were sending 500 firefighters from all over England and Wales, I think as well, we had them from, to come and start to pump out the water in one of the villages. And so we were there with our Red Shield canteen, serving hot dogs and tea and coffee and biscuits and everything else. It was incredibly hot weather that week. I was running out of stuff as I was cooking it. Jonathan was begging, borrowing, I won't say stealing, begging and borrowing from local supermarkets who were replenishing us with food and things to support these 500 firefighters. Again, the Prime Minister came that day to show how interested he was in the poor people who were suffering, along with some other members of the particular party at that time. And everybody was quite happily coming up to the van to get their cup of tea, their hot dog, their bacon butty, whatever it was we were cooking. But of course, he wanted it served to him in a hall somewhere else. And then when it was taken to him, he didn't drink it. But other members of Parliament came up, and I have to say, were absolutely lovely, and asked if they could have hot dogs too, because they'd come up from London, they were having a long day out, so yeah, I said, I'm not proud, I feed anybody. we were feeding them, and some of them actually put their hands in their pockets and gave us a donation to keep the work going, which was very lovely. But I tell you that story because I've never seen things happen so quickly as happened just on that occasion. And the devastation that we were working with for well over a year of trying to help people get back to some sort of normality. We were raising money because school libraries had been completely destroyed. There wasn't a book left. We were raising money for all sorts of things and still working through the mounds of donations. Our son was only a teenager and he was manning our phone. Yeah, somebody needs a cot, somebody needs a bed, somebody needs this, somebody needs that. And he was manning our phone for us as we were running here, there, and everywhere. A few £1,000s of pressure can so easily wipe out anything in its path. Life can sometimes invade our peaceful creeks, taking what we thought was a well-built life and shattering it. Jesus is not teaching us here about a parable about how to build our houses in protected areas, because there are no storm-free zones. It's a parable about foundations, not about avoiding the weather. When the pressure intensifies from all angles, the outcome is determined by the foundation on which our life is built. Jesus helped the people to understand that God was not always going to be there to stop the rains, the flooding, and the tornadoes from invading our lives. But he did expect us to be smart about life, to be careful about the priorities that we build our lives on, to be cautious about who we listen to and what philosophy of life we choose to live by. Because for the people then listening to the story for the first time, and us today, probably knowing the story inside out since we were children, a wrong decision in these foundational areas could still prove our undoing when the pressures and forces of life begin to mount. The idea of foundation is so critical, isn't it? One of the things that a lot of building contractors want to stay away from is digging out and pouring their own foundations. And many building firms actually would employ a specialist to come in and do the foundations for them. Why? Because if you mess up the foundation, you compromise the entire structure. Building our lives on anything other than what Jesus taught is to mess up our foundation, to allow fault lines and cracks to form at the pressure points of life. Just like every solid building has a foundation, then every life, every home, every church has a foundation on which we're built. And Jesus is really asking, what's your foundation? Where do you put your foundations? There are two people in this story of Jesus, and both hear his words, but only one acts on them. A person who hears the words of Jesus and puts them into practice is like the wise builder who builds with the right materials in the right location at the right time. Those who choose other ways are building on sand. And as we know, there's all different kinds of sand. There's the shifting sands that Jesus talked about of false prophets, false preachers and teachers, the new enthusiasms, the things that come our way. There's a shallow sand of the internet. And that's not to condemn the internet because it's very good, but we all know that can also be used for the complete opposite. And young people watching and learning about life just from Facebook and Snapchat and Instagram and all these things is a very shaky foundation. There's a quicksand of self-righteousness. You know, I remember my mum used to have this phrase, "Oh, he's so heavenly minded, he's no earthly use." I'm sure you've heard that one somewhere. This shifting sands of self-righteousness. We can't build on that. There's the shifting sand of endeavoring in our own strength to live a sinless life as your ticket to heaven. We can't build on that. People like Martin Luther, that fantastic, amazing, great reformer, nearly drove himself crazy trying to be the perfect Christian. And it was only when he flung himself totally upon the dependence on the righteousness that comes to us through Christ that Martin Luther found peace and was able to endure all that life then threw at him. Instead, Jesus says, build your life on what I've taught you in the Sermon on the Mount. Just a summary reading through that shows us how to build. Instead of murder and hate, build your life on forgiveness. Instead of revenge and getting even, build your life on reconciliation. Instead of being consumed by things that would disturb, build your life on respect and honoring one another. Instead of being evasive or deceptive, build your life on truth. Instead of hating your enemies, build your life on praying for them. Instead of just being outwardly religious, build your life on those secret acts of kindness and worship. Instead of dedicating your life to the accumulation of wealth, build eternal values into the life of those around you. Instead of worrying your way through life, build your life on a firm trust in the caring hand of God. Instead of judging or being suspicious of others, build your relationships on loving acceptance. Instead of leveraging things to your own favor or manipulating people, build your life on a bended knee of seeking the Father's will when you find yourself in an uncomfortable situation. These are the words of Jesus. These are what he was telling us would give us a sure foundation. For we're all building today. Hearing and reading the words of Jesus are not enough. We have to then carry them into action. We're laying foundations with every decision we make. Do we choose to listen to Christ's words? Do we choose to act on his advice? To listen with no plan to act, to read with no interest to respond, is to miss the whole point of Christ's teaching on the mountain that day. Divine truth is not given to satisfy idle curiosity, but to change our lives, not to lull us to sleep in church, but to equip us for today and to prepare us for eternity. May God bless us as today we continue to work on these foundations. Amen.